Of all the stories of triumph and tragedy that fill the pages of the Bible, few are as heartbreaking, as consequential, or as shockingly relevant to our own divided times as the one you are about to hear. It is a story of a golden age brought to ruin by the slow poison of compromise, of a sacred brotherhood torn apart by jealousy and pride, and of a divine promise that was fractured by the foolishness of human hearts. We live in a world defined by division. We see it in the bitter polarization of politics, in cultural wars that set neighbors against one another, and in families broken by irreconcilable differences. The painful reality of a house divided against itself is a theme that runs through human history. But what few realize is that this pattern of self-destruction is not a modern invention. The definitive blueprint for how a nation uniquely blessed by God can methodically tear itself apart was written 3,000 years ago, etched into the history of God's own chosen people, Israel. This is the story of the division of the kingdom. It is the story of how a nation forged in the fire of Egyptian slavery, miraculously delivered through the Red Sea, sustained in the wilderness, and planted in the promised land by the very hand of God, could turn on itself. It is the story of how the United Kingdom of David and Solomon, a beacon of light, the envy of the world, a testament to God's power and covenant faithfulness, was violently and permanently ripped in two. This schism created a wound that would bleed for centuries, weakening both halves of the nation and ultimately leading to their conquest and exile. At the heart of this national tragedy are three men, three figures whose choices created a perfect storm of spiritual decay and political implosion. First, there is King Solomon, the wise and glorious king whose reign marked the pinnacle of Israel's power, but whose private compromises planted the poisonous seeds of the nation's downfall. Then there is his son, Rehoboam, the arrogant heir to the world's most magnificent throne, a man who inherited absolute power but possessed none of the wisdom required to wield it, losing a kingdom with a few foolish words. And finally, there is Jeroboam, a gifted and ambitious servant, elevated by God's own prophecy to become a king, who, in a moment of crippling fear, made a catastrophic decision that would lead his new nation into irreversible apostasy. To truly understand the depth of this catastrophe, we cannot begin at the moment of the split. That was merely the final, violent earthquake that brought the building down. The foundations, however, had been cracking for decades. To see those cracks, we must go back to the heart of the Golden Age, to the glorious, paradoxical, and ultimately tragic reign of the wisest, wealthiest, and most powerful king Israel would ever know, King Solomon. Solomon's reign began as a divine dream fulfilled. As a young man, standing in the shadow of his legendary father, King David, he was approached by God in a dream at Gibeon and offered anything he wanted. In a moment of profound humility, the young king asked not for riches, nor for long life, nor for the death of his enemies, but for a discerning heart, to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. God was so deeply pleased with this selfless request that he gave Solomon everything. He granted him wisdom unparalleled in human history, before or since. And because he had not asked for them, God also gave him riches and honor beyond any king of his time. Under Solomon, Israel blossomed into its full glory. It was an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, a fulfillment of the ancient promises. The Bible paints a breathtaking picture. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. The kingdom was a commercial powerhouse, controlling the major trade routes. Caravans laden with spices from Arabia, horses from Egypt, and gold from Ophir filled its treasuries. His fame as a sage and ruler spread to the ends of the known world. Kings and queens, like the famous Queen of Sheba, undertook arduous journeys of thousands of miles simply to sit at his feet, to hear his wisdom, and to gaze upon the almost unbelievable splendor of his kingdom. The crowning achievement of his reign, the physical embodiment of Israel's golden age, was the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. This was the dream his father David had cherished but was forbidden to build. Solomon dedicated 7 years and the nation's vast resources to creating a house for the Lord. The project was on a scale never before seen. He brokered a deal with Hiram, king of Tyre, for the finest cedars of Lebanon, massive timbers that were floated down the coast and hauled up to Jerusalem. The foundation was laid with enormous, masterfully cut stones. The construction itself was an act of reverence. The Bible notes that no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built, as the stones were shaped at the quarry to ensure peace at the sacred site. The interior was a world of breathtaking beauty and symbolic richness, a microcosm of heaven on earth. The walls were paneled with fragrant cedar and overlaid with pure gold. Gigantic, gold-plated cherubim with wings stretching 20 cubits stood guard over the most holy place. 10 golden lampstands illuminated the holy place, and a massive bronze basin, the sea, rested on the backs of 12 bronze oxen. When it was finally completed and dedicated, Solomon stood before all of Israel and prayed a magnificent prayer of humility, acknowledging that the heavens themselves could not contain God, let alone this house he had built. In response, a visible manifestation of God's presence, the Shekinah glory, descended as a cloud and filled the temple so powerfully that the priests could not even stand to perform their duties. It was the highest watermark of Israel's history. God was dwelling tangibly among his people in a house built for his name. The covenant with David, promising a lasting dynasty, seemed glorious and unbreakable. Israel was united, prosperous, divinely blessed, and at peace. From the outside, it was a perfect kingdom. But the Bible, in its unflinching honesty, pulls back the golden curtains to reveal a deep and growing sickness within. Even as the glory of God filled the temple, the seeds of destruction were being quietly sown in the king's own palace. The very strengths that defined Solomon's reign, his international renown, and his massive building projects, became the sources of his downfall. His legendary wisdom, which brought him international acclaim, led him down a path of dangerous political compromise. To forge alliances and secure the borders of his burgeoning empire, Solomon entered into a staggering number of political marriages. He took the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, as a wife, a move of immense political significance. But it didn't stop there. He amassed a harem of 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, many from the surrounding nations: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. This was a flagrant public violation of God's most explicit command to his people and their kings. In Deuteronomy, God had clearly warned, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." This law was not about ethnicity. It was a spiritual quarantine designed to protect the heart of the nation from the cancer of idolatry. God knew that these foreign wives would not come alone. They would bring their customs, their traditions, their priests, and their pantheon of foreign gods right into the heart of the kingdom, and ultimately, into the heart of the king himself. And as Solomon aged, the divine warning proved tragically prophetic. The Bible states it with heartbreaking bluntness. His wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. The wise king began to make foolish, fatal compromises. The man who built the magnificent temple for the one true God, Yahweh, now began to finance and construct pagan shrines. On a hill directly east of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, in full view of the holy temple, he built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the horrific, bloodthirsty god of the Ammonites, a deity to whom parents would sacrifice their own children in fire. He did this to appease his foreign wives, trading his wholehearted devotion to the God who had given him everything for a fragile domestic peace. The spiritual light of Israel had begun to dim, eclipsed by the smoke rising from pagan altars built by its own king. The second seed of division was sown by the very projects that made his kingdom glorious. The temple, his own opulent palace which took 13 years to build, the mighty fortifications of Jerusalem, and the strategic cities of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gaza, they all came at a staggering cost. To fund these ambitions, Solomon imposed unprecedentedly heavy taxes on the people. Even more oppressive was his policy of forced labor, the corvée. He conscripted an army of laborers, 30,000 Israelite men, sending them to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. Beyond this, he had another 150,000 men working as carriers and stonecutters in the hill country. This massive system of conscription disrupted family life, agriculture, and the tribal structure of the nation. While Solomon's own tribe of Judah, located in the south, may have received preferential treatment, the burden fell most heavily on the other tribes, particularly the powerful and populous tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh in the north. A deep and bitter resentment began to simmer just beneath the gleaming surface of the kingdom's prosperity. The people were proud of their golden capital, but they were also growing weary and exhausted by the king's relentless demands. They were building a golden kingdom, but it was being built with their sweat, their resources, and their freedom. A dangerous fault line of social and economic discontent was forming, a line that separated the powerful Jerusalem-centric south from the hard-working, resentful north. Into this volatile mixture of spiritual decay and social unrest, God sent a prophet. The time for judgment was approaching, and God was about to announce his verdict. But the message was not delivered to the king in his gilded palace. It was delivered on a dusty road to a man who would become the catalyst for the coming schism, a man whose name would become synonymous with rebellion: Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Jeroboam was no ordinary man, an Ephraimite from the north. The Bible describes him as a man of standing and very industrious. His talent and leadership potential were so obvious that King Solomon himself had noticed him and put him in charge of the entire labor force conscripted from the northern tribes of Joseph. This position gave Jeroboam a unique perspective. He was an insider who knew the workings of the royal court, but was also intimately aware of the northern tribes' growing discontent. He was ambitious, capable, and perfectly positioned. One day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, he was met on a solitary stretch of road by a prophet from the ancient religious center of Shiloh named Ahijah. What happened next was a moment of shocking, symbolic theater. Ahijah took off the brand new cloak he was wearing, a symbol of the newness and integrity of the kingdom as God intended it, and tore it violently into 12 pieces. He then turned to a stunned Jeroboam and said, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give 10 tribes to you." The message was staggering in its clarity. God himself was the one initiating this division. This was not going to be a mere political accident or a popular uprising. It was a deliberate act of divine judgment. It was God's response to Solomon's rampant idolatry, his divided heart, and his blatant disobedience. God, through his prophet, made it clear that he would not completely break his covenant promise to David. For the sake of his faithful servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city where he had placed his name, one tribe, Judah, along with the smaller, the absorbed tribe of Benjamin, would remain under the rule of Solomon's son. But the vast majority of the kingdom, the 10 northern tribes, would be handed over to Jeroboam. Then, God made a remarkable and weighty promise directly to Jeroboam, a promise that held the potential to reshape the future. "If you do whatever I command you and walk in obedience to me, and do what is right in my eyes, by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you." This was an incredible offer. God was offering Jeroboam the chance to be the David of the north. He was being handed a kingdom and the promise of a lasting dynasty, an opportunity for a fresh start for the northern tribes. The only condition was faithfulness. It was a conditional covenant, a profound test of Jeroboam's heart. And as history would painfully reveal, it was a test he would tragically fail. Word of this prophecy inevitably reached the king. Solomon, the man of wisdom, now acted like any other paranoid tyrant. He saw Jeroboam not as an instrument of God's judgment, but as a political threat to be eliminated. He sought to kill him. Jeroboam fled for his life, finding refuge in Egypt under the protection of Pharaoh Shishak. There he remained in exile, a political fugitive biding his time, waiting for the old king to die. He waited, and the kingdom of Israel, outwardly glorious but inwardly rotting, groaned under the weight of its own splendor until, finally, after 40 years of rule, the great King Solomon died and was buried in the city of David. The golden age was over. The stage was set for the final, catastrophic act of this tragedy. The throne passed to Solomon's only named son, Rehoboam. According to custom, all the leaders of the tribes of Israel gathered to officially recognize him as their king. But they did not gather in Jerusalem. They gathered at Shechem, an ancient and symbolic city deep in the heart of the northern territory. It was at Shechem that Abraham had first received God's promise and where Joshua had renewed the covenant. By choosing this location, the northern tribes were sending a clear and powerful message. They would not simply rubber stamp the new king. He had to come to them. They had grievances, and those grievances demanded a hearing. Hearing that Solomon was dead, Jeroboam returned from his exile in Egypt. He was immediately welcomed as a hero, a champion of the people. He became the spokesman for the northern delegation that came to confront the new king. Their request was, on the surface, entirely reasonable and direct. "Your father put a heavy yoke on us," they said to Rehoboam, "but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." This was the ultimate crossroads moment for Israel. The entire future of the united monarchy hinged on Rehoboam's next words. He could choose the path of wisdom, humility, and reconciliation, thereby healing the festering wounds of his father's reign. Or he could choose the path of pride, arrogance, and confrontation and shatter the kingdom forever. Rehoboam, perhaps feeling the immense pressure, asked for 3 days to consider his answer. In that critical interval, he sought counsel. First, he wisely went to the elders, the seasoned counselors who had served his father Solomon. These men had witnessed the kingdom's rise to glory, but they also understood its underlying tensions and the people's growing weariness. Their advice was filled with the profound wisdom of experience. "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer," they told him, "they will be your servants forever." It was the path of servant leadership, a principle that true strength is shown through humility and service. But Rehoboam, a man who had grown up in the lap of unimaginable luxury, surrounded by other entitled young men, chafed at the idea of being a servant. He rejected the advice of the elders. He turned instead to his peers, the companions of his youth, who had grown up with him in the palace. They knew nothing of hardship, statecraft, or the lives of common people. Their counsel was the exact opposite of the elders, fueled by the toxic mixture of youthful testosterone, deep insecurity, and a tyrannical view of power. They advised him to project an image of absolute, brutal strength, to crush any thought of dissent before it could begin. "This is what you should tell them," they urged with macho bravado. "My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." It was the most foolish, arrogant, and inflammatory advice imaginable. And the weak, insecure Rehoboam embraced it as strength. When Jeroboam and the people returned on the 3rd day, their hearts filled with hope for reform, the young king, stood before them. Puffed up with borrowed arrogance, he delivered the devastating words his friends had scripted for him. The effect was immediate and explosive. The simmering resentment of decades of toil and disrespect boiled over in an instant. The ancient cry of Northern Rebellion, a slogan of secession, echoed through the assembly at Shechem. What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. In that moment, the kingdom was irrevocably shattered. The 10 northern tribes renounced their allegiance to the house of David forever. Rehoboam, in a stunning display of political blindness, still failed to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. He sent out Adoniram, the man who was in charge of forced labor, the very symbol of their oppression, to try and assert his authority. The people's response was swift, unified, and brutal. They stoned Adoniram to death. Finally realizing his life was in danger, the terrified King Rehoboam scrambled into his royal chariot and fled ignominiously back to the safety of Jerusalem. He would remain a king, but his kingdom had shrunk to a fraction of its former glory. He would rule only over the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The great united monarchy of David and Solomon was no more. Ahijah's prophecy of the torn cloak had been fulfilled to the letter. Back in Jerusalem, Rehoboam's wounded pride still burned. He assembled a massive army, 180,000 of the finest warriors from Judah and Benjamin, with the intent to wage a bloody civil war and force the northern tribes back into submission. But God intervened one last time to prevent the slaughter. He sent a prophet named Shemaiah with a direct, unambiguous command. This is what the Lord says: do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. And to their credit, the army listened to the word of the Lord and disbanded. The civil war was averted, but the division was now permanent, sealed and sanctioned by God's own decree. The political separation was now complete, but what happened next reveals the deepest, most enduring tragedy of this story. King Jeroboam, now ruling over the newly formed northern kingdom of Israel, faced a serious political and religious dilemma. According to God's law given to Moses, all Israelite men were required to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the major pilgrimage feasts, to worship and offer sacrifices at the temple. The problem was that the temple and the holy city of Jerusalem were in the territory of his enemy, Rehoboam. Jeroboam's mind was consumed by political fear. The Bible gives us a window into his anxious thoughts. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. His fear of losing his grip on power completely blinded him to the incredible promise God had personally made to him. He forgot that God was the one who had given him the kingdom. He forgot that God had promised him an enduring dynasty, just like David's, if he would only be faithful. Instead of trusting in God's promise, he put his trust in his own shrewd, cynical political maneuvering. And in this state of faithless fear, he made a fateful, catastrophic decision. He committed a foundational sin that would define his legacy and seal the ultimate doom of the northern kingdom. After seeking advice, not from prophets, but from political strategists, the king commissioned the creation of 2 golden calves. He set one up in Bethel, a location of sacred history near the southern border of his kingdom, and the other in Dan, in the far north. Then he stood before the people and made a declaration that was both a political masterstroke and a spiritual abomination. It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. It was a sin of horrific, blasphemous proportions, a deliberate and cynical echo of the great sin of Aaron at the foot of Mount Sinai. Jeroboam was not necessarily telling the people to worship foreign gods. He was creating a corrupt, counterfeit version of the worship of Yahweh, the one true God. The golden calves, like the one Aaron made, were likely intended to be visible pedestals or representations of the invisible God, a practice strictly forbidden by the Second Commandment. He was institutionalizing idolatry for the sake of political convenience. To complete his rebellion, he built rival shrines on high places, appointed priests from any tribe who were loyal to him, not exclusively from the tribe of Levi, as God had commanded, and he even invented his own religious festival in the 8th month to replace the God-ordained Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month. He created a complete, state-sponsored religious system to rival the one ordained by God in Jerusalem, all to prevent his people from going south, and all to secure his own throne. God immediately sent a man of God from Judah to Bethel to prophesy against Jeroboam's altar, miraculously withering the king's hand and splitting the altar as a sign. Yet even after this, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way. This act became known forever in the biblical record as the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. For the next 200 years of the northern kingdom's existence, every one of its 19 kings would be measured against this standard, and every single one would fail the test. The Bible's verdict is relentless and repetitive. King after king walked in the ways of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he had caused Israel to commit. The spiritual poison he injected into the nation's bloodstream at its very birth ensured that it would never be spiritually healthy. The southern kingdom of Judah, meanwhile, embarked on its own tumultuous journey. Rehoboam and his successors were far from perfect. They too often flirted with idolatry and disobeyed God. But there was a crucial difference. Judah still had the legitimate temple in Jerusalem. It still had the God-ordained Levitical priesthood, and most importantly, it still had the unconditional covenant promise of God to the house of David. Because of this, periodically, righteous kings like Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah would rise up and lead the nation in great revivals, calling the people back to repentance, tearing down the idols, and restoring the true worship of God as prescribed in the law. There was a theological anchor in the South, a thread of faithfulness that, while often stretched thin, was never completely broken. The northern kingdom had no such anchor. It was spiritually adrift from its first day, a kingdom founded on a sin of rebellion and fear. Its history became a tragic and chaotic cycle of wicked kings, political assassinations, coups, and a descent into ever deeper paganism. God, in his immense mercy, did not immediately abandon them. He sent a succession of powerful prophets, Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, to confront their sin and call them back. They performed mighty miracles and preached messages of fiery judgment and tender hope. But the nation, led by its corrupt kings and comfortable in its convenient religion, consistently refused to listen. This tragic division, born from Solomon's compromise and Rehoboam's pride, set both kingdoms on a path to ultimate destruction. Weakened by their internal sins and frequent warfare with each other, they became easy prey for the great predatory empires rising around them. The northern kingdom of Israel, having never once repented of the foundational sin of Jeroboam, was the first to fall. In 722 BC, the mighty Assyrian Empire swept down from the north, conquered the land, and carried the 10 tribes into exile, scattering them among the nations, where they were effectively lost to history. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted for another century and a half, but they too eventually succumbed to their own persistent sin. After ignoring the tearful warnings of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, they were conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Jerusalem was sacked, and the glorious Temple of Solomon was burned to the ground. The story of the division of Israel is far more than a dry account of ancient history. It is a powerful and timeless warning, a case study in national implosion. It shows how the slow drip of spiritual compromise, even in an age of unprecedented blessing, can erode the foundations of a nation. It demonstrates how the blinding pride and insecurity of a single leader can shatter a legacy of unity built over generations. And it reveals a profound truth that echoes down to our own day. Political solutions can never fix what are, at their core, spiritual problems. Jeroboam tried to secure his kingdom with a political religion, and in doing so, he damned it to utter destruction. This moment in history is a vital lesson written for all of us. A reminder that obedience to God is the only true foundation for lasting security, and that the fear of man will always lead to a snare, while trusting in the Lord leads to life. If this story, and the deep lessons it contains, is helping you understand the Bible in a new and relevant way, please take a moment to give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comment box below. What part of this tragic story stands out to you the most? Your interaction is what helps others discover these critical truths from God's Word. The division of the kingdom was a tragedy of immense proportions, but it was not the end of God's plan. Even in judgment, God's redemptive purpose moves forward. The line of David, preserved in the southern kingdom of Judah, would eventually produce the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ. He is the one who came to heal the broken, to reunite the scattered flock of God, and to establish a spiritual kingdom that can never be divided. He is the true King who invites us into his eternal, unshakable kingdom, a kingdom whose citizens are united not by geography or politics, but by faith in him. But the immediate aftermath of the split plunged Israel into a dark and dangerous new era. The sin of Jeroboam opened the floodgates to idolatry, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in all of Scripture. A showdown on a mountaintop between a lone, fiery prophet of God and hundreds of prophets of a wicked, pagan God, with the very soul of the nation hanging in the balance. If you're ready to see how God responded to Israel's deepening apostasy, click on the video you see on your screen right now to discover the incredible story of Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. You won't want to miss it. Blessings.